You think history is weird. You haven't seen anything yet. The Old West had mysteries so bizarre, so unexplainable, so absolutely insane that historians quietly buried them because they didn't fit the narrative. Today, you're getting 20 forbidden secrets that sound like horror movies but actually happened. Disappearances with no explanation, creatures that shouldn't exist, events that defy logic, and stories so strange that textbooks pretend they never occurred. Stay until the end because number 20 will leave you speechless. Let's dive in. Number 1. The mysterious disappearance of the entire town of Hoher Verde. In 1923, a small mining town in New Mexico called Hoher Verde simply vanished. We're not talking about people gradually leaving over time due to economic hardship. We're talking about an entire population of over 1,200 people disappearing without a trace overnight. A group of travelers passing through on their way to Albuquerque found the town completely abandoned in circumstances that defied all logic. Meals were left half-eaten on tables in the town's restaurant and in private homes. Witnesses who investigated immediately said the food was still warm, suggesting people had been there within hours, not days. Tools were lying in the street as if workers had dropped them mid-task. The general store was open, money still in the register, shelves fully stocked. Livestock were still in pens, unfed and distressed, indicating their owners had been gone for at least 12 to 24 hours. But every single human being, from newborn bobbies to elderly residents, was gone. What made it stranger was the complete lack of signs of struggle or panic. No blood, no broken furniture, no overturned chairs, no evidence of violence, fire, or natural disaster. No wagon tracks leaving town. No footprints heading into the desert or mountains. It looked like everyone had simultaneously stopped what they were doing, stood up, and walked away in the same moment, leaving everything behind. Personal belongings, family photographs, money, gold from the mine, everything of value was untouched. The official explanation was that the town was gradually abandoned due to economic decline, and the story was exaggerated over time. But locals who investigated immediately after the discovery swore that meals were still warm, and animals had only been without care for hours, not days or weeks. Some claim to have found strange symbols carved into trees around the town's perimeter, symbols that didn't match any known Native American or settler markings. The town site was eventually demolished and the land sold. Today, almost no trace of Hoher Verde exists, and official records about it are mysteriously sparse. Whether it was mass hysteria, a coordinated cult exodus, or something stranger, no one has ever definitively explained what happened to those 1,200 people. Number 2. The Tombstone Thunderbird photograph that vanished from history. In April 1890, two cowboys in Tombstone, Arizona, claimed they shot and killed a massive bird unlike anything known to science. They described it as having a wingspan of over 30 feet, leathery wings like a bat, a long serpentine neck, and a beak filled with sharp teeth. They said it looked like a pterodactyl, a creature that supposedly went extinct millions of years ago. According to the story published in the Tombstone Epitaph newspaper, the cowboys dragged the creature's body back to town and nailed it to the side of a barn with its wings spread. A photographer was called, and a picture was taken showing the two cowboys standing beside the massive creature, their heads barely reaching the top of its folded wings. The photograph was allegedly published in the newspaper, and copies circulated through nearby towns. Here's where it gets strange. No one can find the photograph. For over a century, people have searched archives, newspaper collections, private collections, and historical societies. Hundreds of people claim to remember seeing the photograph in books, magazines, or family albums when they were children. They describe it in consistent detail. But when they go back to look for it, it's gone. The negative was never found. The newspaper that supposedly published it has no record of the story in preserved editions from that date. Skeptics say the whole thing is a false memory, a collective confabulation based on stories and hoaxes. But the sheer number of people who swear they saw the photograph, and the consistency of their descriptions keeps the mystery alive. Either there was a real photograph that was systematically removed from history, or something very strange happened to human memory on a mass scale. Number 3. The Donner Party's hidden cannibalism pact and the survivor who went insane. Everyone knows the Donner Party story. A group of pioneers got trapped in the Sierra Nevada mountains during the winter of 1846 to 1847, ran out of food, and resorted to cannibalism to survive. That's the sanitized version taught in schools. What's not widely taught is how organized and ritualistic the cannibalism became, how long it went on, and what happened to the survivors afterward when they tried to reintegrate into society. According to journals and testimony that were suppressed for decades and only released to researchers in the 1900s, the survivors didn't just eat the dead out of desperation after all other options were exhausted. They created a system that became increasingly disturbing as the winter dragged on. When people died of starvation or exposure, the strongest survivors would butcher the bodies methodically, removing organs, separating meat from bone, and labeling the cuts by person as if they were livestock in a butcher shop. They kept records of who had eaten whose flesh, possibly to remember or possibly out of some twisted sense of accounting. Some survivors later claimed, in private letters discovered by historians, that certain members of the party had developed a preference for human flesh and continued seeking it even after rescue became possible and regular food was available. They described members who would refuse deer meat or other game, claiming it tasted wrong compared to what they'd become accustomed to eating. One survivor, a young man named Louis Keseberg, was accused by other survivors of murdering people to eat them rather than waiting for them to die. He was ostracized after rescue and spent the rest of his life defending himself against accusations that he enjoyed cannibalism. He opened a restaurant in Sacramento, and rumors spread that he was serving human meat. The restaurant failed, and Keseberg died in poverty and madness, reportedly talking to people who weren't there and claiming the dead visited him at night. Another survivor, a woman named Tamsen Donner, chose to stay behind in the mountains with her dying husband rather than be rescued. Her body was never found. When rescuers returned weeks later, her husband's body had been partially consumed, but there were signs that someone had been living in the camp after his death. Some believe Tamsen survived by cannibalizing her husband and others, then disappeared into the wilderness rather than face judgment. Number 4. The Oliver Loving ghost that haunted Charles Goodnight for decades. Oliver Loving was a legendary cattleman and partner of Charles Goodnight. In 1867, while driving cattle through hostile territory in Texas, Loving was ambushed by Comanche warriors. He was shot multiple times and left for dead. He managed to crawl and hide for days, surviving on muddy water and his own willpower, before being found by Mexican traders who took him to Fort Sumner, New Mexico. Loving's wounds became infected. Gangrene set in. He died in agony at Fort Sumner, but before he died, he made Goodnight promise to bury him back in Texas, not in New Mexico. Goodnight honored the promise, having Loving's body preserved in a metal casket filled with charcoal and transported over 600 miles back to Texas for burial. But according to Goodnight's private letters and the testimony of ranch hands who worked for him, Loving didn't stay buried. For the next 40 years, Goodnight claimed to see Loving's ghost regularly. Not in dreams, in waking life. Loving would appear on the trail, riding beside Goodnight during cattle drives, offering advice and warnings. Ranch hands reported seeing a figure matching Loving's description standing at the edge of camps at night, watching the herd. Goodnight, a tough, no-nonsense cattleman not known for superstition or fantasy, insisted until his death in 1929 that Loving's spirit never left him. He said Loving was still riding the trail, still watching over the cattle, still keeping his promise to be Goodnight's partner. Skeptics say Goodnight was dealing with trauma and guilt, but those who knew him said he was completely sane and serious when he talked about Loving's ghost. Number 5. The Bigfoot encounters reported by miners in California. Long before Bigfoot became a pop culture phenomenon, miners in Northern California during the Gold Rush were reporting encounters with massive, ape-like creatures in the mountains. These weren't casual sightings. These were violent encounters that left men terrified and sometimes injured. In 1855, a group of miners near the Klamath River reported being attacked at night by creatures they described as giant hairy men who threw rocks, destroyed their camp, and screamed in ways that didn't sound human or animal. The miners abandoned their claim and refused to return, even though they'd been finding gold. Similar reports came from miners across the Sierra Nevada throughout the 1850s and 1860s. In 1924, decades before the famous Patterson-Gimlin Bigfoot film, a group of miners at the Ape Canyon in Washington reported a terrifying night siege by creatures they called mountain devils. The creatures threw rocks at their cabin for hours, trying to break in. The miners fired their rifles through gaps in the walls, claiming they hit at least one creature. In the morning, they found massive footprints but no bodies. They fled and never returned. What makes these accounts credible is that they happened before Bigfoot was part of popular culture. These men had no cultural template for what they were describing. They weren't trying to sell stories or make money. They were just terrified miners who abandoned profitable claims because something in those mountains scared them more than poverty. Native American tribes in the region had stories about similar creatures going back centuries, but white settlers dismissed them as superstition until they encountered the same things. Number 6. The Bell Witch haunting that terrorized a Tennessee family and killed a man. While not technically Old West since it happened in Tennessee, the Bell Witch haunting from 1817 to 1821 was one of the most documented and disturbing paranormal events in American frontier history, and it influenced how settlers viewed the supernatural as they moved west. The Bell family started experiencing strange phenomena on their farm: knocking sounds, voices with no source, objects moving on their own, and physical attacks. The entity, which called itself Kate, spoke to the family and visitors, predicted the future, quoted scripture, and sang hymns. It also tormented the family patriarch, John Bell, with increasing violence. Over 4 years, hundreds of people visited the Bell farm and witnessed the phenomena. Future President Andrew Jackson visited and reportedly fled after his wagon wheels locked mysteriously, and his men were slapped by invisible hands. Local preachers tried exorcisms and failed. The entity seemed to grow stronger and angrier. In 1820, John Bell became seriously ill. He suffered seizures and lost the ability to speak. Kate the entity claimed responsibility, saying she was poisoning him. On December 20, 1820, Bell died. A small vial of unknown liquid was found near his body. When the family gave a drop of it to a cat, the animal died instantly. Kate's voice was heard throughout the house that night, singing, laughing, and celebrating Bell's death. After Bell's death, the activity decreased and eventually stopped. Kate promised to return in 1828, and some family members reported a brief resurgence of phenomena that year. The case was investigated by educated men, doctors, and clergy, many of whom left written testimony that they couldn't explain what they experienced. It remains one of the only documented cases in American history where a supernatural entity is blamed for a human death with witnesses who were considered credible. Number 7. The Lost Ship of the Desert in California. For over 150 years, treasure hunters in the California desert have searched for a Spanish galleon ship sitting in the middle of the Mojave Desert, miles from any ocean. The ship supposedly contains treasure and has been spotted by dozens of people, but every search party that goes looking for it finds nothing. The legend goes that in the 1600s, a Spanish galleon sailed up the Gulf of California during an unusually high tide, possibly looking for the fabled Strait of Anian, a supposed passage to the Pacific. The ship became stranded when the waters receded, leaving it sitting in what would become desert. The crew died of thirst and heat, and the ship was buried over time by shifting sands, only appearing occasionally when wind and erosion uncover it. Sightings have been reported since the 1850s. Prospectors, native guides, and even a few military expeditions claim to have seen the ship's mast or hull sticking out of the sand. Some claim to have approached it and seen skeletons and treasure inside. But when they returned with others, they could never find it again. The desert had swallowed it. Skeptics say it's impossible for a ship to be that far inland, and that the stories are hallucinations caused by heat and dehydration. But geological evidence shows that the Gulf of California once extended much farther north, and there are ancient lakebeds in the area that could have briefly connected to the sea. Whether there's really a treasure ship under the sand or just a persistent myth created by desperate prospectors, the lost ship of the desert remains one of the West's most enduring mysteries. Number 8. The mysterious cattle mutilations that started in the 1800s. Most people think cattle mutilations are a modern phenomenon linked to UFO conspiracies starting in the 1970s. But ranchers in the Old West were reporting identical mutilations over a century earlier, and they were just as baffled and terrified. Starting in the 1870s, ranchers across Colorado, New Mexico, Kansas, and Texas reported finding cattle dead with surgical precision cuts. Organs were removed with clean incisions that looked like they were made with scalpels, not teeth or claws. Blood was completely drained. No tracks were found around the bodies, not from predators, not from humans, not from anything. The cattle showed no signs of struggle, as if they died instantly and peacefully before being mutilated. What made ranchers truly afraid was the pattern. The mutilations would cluster in an area for weeks or months, then stop completely and appear somewhere else hundreds of miles away. Ranchers who stayed up all night watching their herds saw nothing, but would find mutilated cattle in the morning. Some reported strange lights in the sky the night before finding dead animals. Others reported an eerie silence, as if all the wildlife in the area had fled. Law enforcement was useless. Sheriffs and marshals investigated, found no evidence, and wrote the deaths off as predator kills even though no predator killed like that. Ranchers who were losing money demanded answers but never got them. Some formed armed watch groups and patrolled at night. It didn't matter. The mutilations continued. By the early 1900s, the phenomenon had decreased but never fully stopped. Modern cattle mutilations continue to be reported with the same characteristics, and veterinarians and investigators still can't explain them. The fact that this was happening 150 years ago, long before modern hoaxers had the tools to pull off such precise work, makes it even more disturbing. Number 9. The Aurora, Texas UFO crash of 1897. On April 17, 1897, a cigar-shaped flying object allegedly crashed into a windmill in the small town of Aurora, Texas. According to reports published in the Dallas Morning News, the object exploded, and debris scattered across the property of Judge J.S. Proctor. In the wreckage, townspeople found the body of the pilot, a small humanoid creature that didn't look human. The local newspaper reported that T.J. Weems, a supposed U.S. Army Signal Service officer, examined the body and the debris and concluded that the pilot was not an inhabitant of this world. The townspeople allegedly gave the creature a Christian burial in the Aurora Cemetery, and the debris was thrown into a nearby well. For decades, this story was dismissed as a hoax, probably written by the newspaper to attract attention to the dying town. But in the 1970s, UFO investigators began looking into it seriously. They found elderly residents who remembered their grandparents talking about the crash. Metal detector scans of the cemetery found an unmarked grave with unusual metallic readings. When investigators tried to exhume the grave for examination, the Cemetery Association blocked them. The well where the debris was supposedly thrown was found and tested. Water samples showed high levels of aluminum and other metals not typically found in well water. The well was sealed with concrete by unknown parties before further testing could be done. Judge Proctor's property, where the crash supposedly happened, showed evidence of a massive fire or explosion at some point in the past, and metal fragments found in the soil had unusual properties. Whether the Aurora crash really happened or was an elaborate hoax that took on a life of its own, the fact remains that something strange occurred, and someone went to a lot of trouble to make sure it couldn't be investigated further. Number 10. The Yuba County Five and the missing man who was never found. In February 1978, just outside our Old West timeline but connected to events that started in frontier days, 5 men from Yuba County, California, drove to a basketball game and vanished. Their car was found abandoned on a remote mountain road with the keys inside, the windows rolled up, and the gas tank a quarter full. 4 of the 5 men's bodies were eventually found months later in and around a remote Forest Service trailer, but the circumstances were so bizarre that investigators couldn't piece together what happened. The men had driven 70 miles in the wrong direction from where they were headed, up a mountain road that was snowed in and impassable. Why they went there, no one knows. One man, Jack Madruga, was found dead in the trailer, apparently having starved to death despite the trailer being stocked with food. Another man, Ted Weiher, was found wrapped in sheets in a storage area, also starved, despite being within reach of food supplies. The trailer had a locker full of military rations, enough to keep all 5 men alive for months. The heat was off even though the trailer had a propane heater. It looked like the men had locked themselves in the trailer and chosen to starve rather than eat the food or leave. The other 3 men's remains were found scattered in the woods, dead from exposure. What makes this connect to Old West mysteries is that the area where they disappeared, the Plumas National Forest, has been the site of strange disappearances going back to the 1800s. Native American tribes avoided the area, calling it cursed. Miners and trappers reported strange lights, feelings of dread, and compasses that wouldn't work correctly. At least a dozen people vanished in those mountains during the Gold Rush era, and their bodies were never found. The Yuba County Five case is just the most recent and best documented. Number 11. The Green River Formation and the giant skeletons no museum will display. In the 1880s and 1890s, miners and archaeologists in Wyoming's Green River Formation began uncovering massive human skeletons, some measuring over 8 feet tall. Newspapers across the country reported the discoveries. The Lovelock Tribune, the New York Times, and regional papers published stories about giant skeletons with double rows of teeth being found in Nevada, California, and throughout the West. Some of these discoveries were made by trained archaeologists and sent to the Smithsonian Institution for study. The Smithsonian acknowledged receiving them, but today, those skeletons are nowhere to be found. The Smithsonian claims they were lost, misidentified, or never existed. Critics say the skeletons were deliberately destroyed or hidden because they contradicted the established narrative of human history in North America. Native American oral traditions from dozens of tribes describe a race of giants that lived in North America before modern tribes arrived. The Paiute people of Nevada have detailed stories about red-haired giants that they warred with and eventually exterminated. When Lovelock Cave in Nevada was excavated in 1911, researchers found mummified remains of people over 7 feet tall with reddish hair, exactly matching the Paiute legends. Why would evidence of unusually tall ancient people be suppressed? Some researchers believe it's because it complicates migration theories and challenges academic careers built on specific models of human development. Others think there's a more disturbing reason. If there were distinct populations of very tall humans in ancient America, and if they were systematically wiped out, that's a genocide that predates European contact, and it suggests human violence and tribal warfare in the Americas was far more extensive than is typically acknowledged. Number 12. The Phantom Stagecoach of Yellowstone. Park rangers, tourists, and locals near Yellowstone National Park have reported seeing a ghostly stagecoach racing through the wilderness for over 140 years. The coach is always described the same way: a black stagecoach pulled by four horses, driven by a headless man, racing at impossible speed and vanishing without a trace. The legend originated in the 1870s when a stagecoach carrying gold and passengers was ambushed by bandits near what is now Yellowstone. Everyone on board was killed, including the driver, who was decapitated. The gold was never found, and the stagecoach was supposedly thrown into a ravine and lost. Shortly after, sightings of the phantom coach began. What makes this story notable is how many credible witnesses have reported it. Park rangers, some with decades of experience, have filed official reports about seeing the coach. In 1950, a group of tourists photographed something they claimed was the phantom coach. The photograph shows a dark, blurry shape that could be a coach, but skeptics say it's just shadows and pareidolia. The tourists insisted they watched it race past them on a trail where no vehicle could physically go, then disappear into trees. In the 1990s, a group of historians tried to investigate the legend by researching stage routes and ambush records. They found evidence that a stagecoach attack did occur near the area in 1877, and that the driver's body was found decapitated. But records of what happened to the gold or the passengers are missing from archives. It's as if someone removed the files deliberately. Whether the phantom coach is a ghost, a mass hallucination, or a very persistent hoax, it's one of the West's most enduring unexplained phenomena. Number 13. The Salish Sea Feet Mystery that connects to old shipwrecks. Since 2007, over 20 severed human feet in sneakers have washed up on the shores of the Salish Sea between Washington and British Columbia. Medical examiners determined the feet naturally separated from bodies due to decomposition in water, and DNA testing identified some as belonging to missing persons or suicide victims. But what's strange is that the area has a history of body parts washing ashore going back to the frontier era. In the 1880s, loggers and fishermen in the region reported finding partial human remains, often feet still in boots, washing up on beaches. Native tribes in the area had legends about the sea taking people and returning only pieces. Some remains were identified as sailors from shipwrecks, but many were never identified and showed signs of having been in the water for years or even decades. The Salish Sea area has unusual currents and underwater geography that apparently preserves some remains while scattering others. But the sheer number of feet that have washed up, both modern and historical, suggests there are far more bodies in those waters than can be accounted for by known shipwrecks and drownings. Some researchers believe there are undiscovered mass graves or shipwrecks in the area. Others think something about the water chemistry or marine life preserves feet specifically, while destroying other body parts faster. What connects this to the Old West is that some of the oldest remains found in the 1800s were wearing footwear that predates known shipwrecks in the area. Where did those bodies come from? Were they victims of unreported crimes, forgotten shipwrecks, or something else entirely? The mystery remains unsolved. Number 14. The Screaming Skulls of the Southwest that won't stay buried. Several locations across the Southwest have skulls that, according to local legend and the testimony of people who have tried to remove them, scream when they're moved and cause disasters until they're returned. These aren't metaphorical stories. These are documented accounts of people hearing sounds and experiencing events after disturbing these skulls. One famous case involves a skull found in a collapsed mine shaft in Arizona in the 1930s. The skull, which appeared to be Native American, was taken by a collector who wanted to add it to his personal museum. Within days, his house was plagued by loud crashing sounds at night, objects flying off shelves, and what he described as blood-curdling screams that seemed to come from the skull itself. He returned the skull to the mine shaft, and the phenomena stopped. Another skull, found in a cave in New Mexico in the 1950s, was taken by archaeology students for study. 3 of the 5 students died in accidents within a month, one in a car crash, one from a fall, and one from a sudden illness. The surviving students returned the skull to the cave, and both later reported nightmares and feelings of being watched that lasted for years. They refused to ever discuss the skull publicly until decades later. Skeptics say these are coincidences amplified by superstition and guilt, but the pattern holds across multiple unconnected cases. Skulls are taken, strange things happen, the skulls are returned, and the events stop. Whether it's genuine supernatural activity, psychological effects manifesting as physical phenomena, or elaborate hoaxes, the screaming skull legends have kept people from disturbing Native American remains in certain areas more effectively than any law. Number 15. The Superstition Mountains Curse that has killed over 600 people. The Superstition Mountains in Arizona are home to the legend of the Lost Dutchman's gold mine, but they're also one of the deadliest locations in the American West. Since the 1840s, over 600 people have died in those mountains under mysterious circumstances. Some deaths are explained as accidents, dehydration, or falls, but many others defy explanation. Bodies have been found decapitated with no murder weapon nearby. Experienced hikers have vanished without a trace despite massive search efforts. Some people who enter the superstitions report feeling an overwhelming sense of dread, hearing voices telling them to leave, or seeing figures that disappear when approached. Apache oral tradition says the mountains are cursed, a place where the thunder god lives and punishes those who seek gold. In 1931, Adolf Ruth, an experienced treasure hunter, entered the superstitions looking for the Lost Dutchman mine. Months later, his headless body was found. His skull, discovered separately, had a bullet hole, but the angle suggested it couldn't have been self-inflicted or fired from ground level. His personal journal, found with the body, contained increasingly paranoid entries about being watched and followed by something he couldn't see. The final entry read, "I have found the mine. God help me." More recently, in 2010, 3 hikers disappeared in the superstitions. 2 were found dead from exposure, but the third vanished completely. Search dogs lost the scent at a specific spot and refused to go further, cowering and whining. Helicopters with thermal imaging found no trace. It's as if the person simply ceased to exist at that exact location. The superstitions continue to claim lives, and no amount of warning signs or ranger patrols has stopped people from going in and never coming out. Number 16. The ghost town of Bodie, where tourists report seeing residents. Bodie, California, is one of the best preserved ghost towns in America. It's a state park where buildings are maintained exactly as they were when the town died in the early 1900s. Tourists walk through homes with tables still set for dinner, saloons with bottles on the bar, and stores with goods on shelves. And many of those tourists report seeing people in period clothing who vanish when approached. Park rangers have documented hundreds of reports of full-body apparitions, not shadows or mists, but clear figures of men and women in 1880s clothing walking through buildings, sitting in chairs, or standing at windows. Photographs taken by tourists often show figures that weren't visible when the photo was taken. Some visitors report hearing piano music coming from the saloon when there's no one inside, and the piano hasn't worked in a century. What makes Bodie different from typical ghost town legends is the sheer volume and consistency of reports. These aren't drunk locals telling campfire stories. These are families, school groups, and historians who all report seeing the same types of figures in the same locations. Some park rangers refuse to work alone in certain buildings because of their own experiences. One ranger reported seeing a little girl in a blue dress playing in the street. When he approached to tell her the park was closing, she looked at him, smiled, and walked through the wall of a building. He later found a photograph from 1882 showing a girl in an identical blue dress standing in the same spot. The girl had died of illness in 1883. The ranger transferred to a different park. Skeptics say it's mass suggestion and the power of expectation. But the fact remains that Bodie has more documented paranormal reports than almost any other location in the West, and many of the witnesses are credible people with no interest in ghost stories or the supernatural. Number 17. The Skinwalker Ranch before it became famous. Long before Skinwalker Ranch became a pop culture phenomenon and reality TV show, ranchers in that part of Utah were reporting impossible events. The Ute tribe warned settlers in the 1800s not to build on that land, saying it was on the path of the Skinwalker, a malevolent shape-shifting entity in Navajo and Ute tradition. Settlers ignored the warnings. Ranches built on that land experienced livestock mutilations, strange lights, technology failures, and sightings of creatures that looked like wolves but walked on two legs. Multiple families abandoned ranches in the area between 1880 and 1950, citing events they couldn't explain and wouldn't talk about publicly because they feared being called insane. One family in the 1910s reported that their cattle were being killed by something that would paralyze them first, then drain their blood without leaving a mark. The family patriarch set up a watch one night and claimed he saw a creature that looked like a wolf but had hands instead of front paws. He shot it multiple times with a rifle. The creature ran away, leaving a blood trail that stopped abruptly after 50 feet, as if it had vanished into thin air. The area became known locally as a cursed valley where nothing good ever happened. By the 1990s, when the Sherman family bought the ranch that would later become famous, they were continuing a tradition of weird events that had been documented for over a century. The difference was that by the 1990s, they were willing to talk about it publicly, and researchers were willing to investigate. But the strangeness didn't start with them. It had always been there. Number 18. The Mercy Brown Vampire Panic and the Exhumations. In 1892, in Exeter, Rhode Island, tuberculosis was killing the Brown family one by one. When 19-year-old Mercy Brown died of the disease, her brother Edwin was also sick and dying. Desperate townspeople, including Mercy's father, believed that one of the dead family members was rising from the grave at night as a vampire and feeding on Edwin, causing his illness. The town exhumed the bodies of Mercy, her mother, and her sister to check for signs of vampirism. Mercy's mother and sister had decomposed normally, but Mercy's body, which had been buried in winter in frozen ground, was still relatively preserved. Her heart contained liquid blood, which the townspeople took as proof she was undead. They cut out her heart, burned it, mixed the ashes with water, and forced Edwin to drink it as a cure. He died anyway 2 months later. This wasn't an isolated incident. Throughout New England and parts of the West where New England settlers had moved, vampire panics led to exhumations and desecration of bodies between 1790 and 1900. Families desperate to save dying relatives would dig up the dead, check for signs of vampirism, and perform gruesome rituals. These weren't uneducated peasants. These were farmers, shopkeepers, and church-going Christians who believed vampires were real and could be stopped through specific methods passed down through folklore. The Mercy Brown case was the last major vampire panic in America, but it reveals how frontier people dealt with diseases they didn't understand by resorting to supernatural explanations and horrifying rituals. It also shows how quickly scientific knowledge could vanish in isolated areas, replaced by folk beliefs that would have been rejected in cities. Number 19. The petroglyphs that show spacecraft and figures in spacesuits. Throughout the Southwest, in Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, and Nevada, there are ancient petroglyphs carved by indigenous people thousands of years ago. Some of these carvings show images that look disturbingly like modern spacecraft, astronauts in suits, and beings with large heads, and eyes that match descriptions of aliens in modern UFO lore. The most famous examples are in Sego Canyon, Utah, where large humanoid figures are carved with intricate details showing what appear to be helmets, antennas, and suits. The figures are called the Barrier Canyon-style figures, and are estimated to be between 2,000 and 4,000 years old. They don't look like any known human depiction from that era. They look like science fiction. Mainstream archaeologists say these are stylized spirit beings or shamans in ceremonial dress, not depictions of actual visitors. But the detail is striking. Some figures have what look like breathing tubes or communication devices. Others appear to be floating or flying. And the consistency across multiple sites hundreds of miles apart suggests a shared cultural memory of something that was seen or experienced. Native American oral traditions sometimes include stories of star people or sky beings who visited Earth long ago and shared knowledge with humans. The Hopi, Zuni, and other tribes have detailed legends about beings from the sky who came down, lived among people, taught them, and then left with promises to return. The petroglyphs might be artistic records of those legends, or they might be something more literal. Either way, they're disturbing to look at because they suggest that people thousands of years ago encountered something that made them carve images that look exactly like modern depictions of extraterrestrials. Number 20. The time slips reported by travelers on the Santa Fe Trail. The Santa Fe Trail was one of the most important trade routes in the Old West, connecting Missouri to New Mexico. But travelers on the trail reported something bizarre that happened repeatedly over decades. Time seemed to behave strangely in certain areas. People would lose hours or even days with no memory of where they went or what happened. Multiple wagon trains reported leaving a specific landmark in the morning, traveling for what felt like an hour or two, then realizing the sun was setting and an entire day had passed. Some travelers reported seeing things that didn't belong, buildings that weren't there when they returned the next day, or people in strange clothing who spoke languages they didn't recognize. When they tried to interact with these people, the figures would vanish or ignore them completely. One documented case from 1867 involves a mail carrier who left Fort Leavenworth for Santa Fe and arrived 4 days late with no memory of the missing time. His horse was exhausted as if it had been running nonstop, but the man had no injuries, no signs of illness, and no explanation for what happened. Other travelers on the same route reported seeing him riding hard as if fleeing something, but when they called out, he didn't respond and rode past as if in a trance. In the 1880s, after the railroad reduced traffic on the Santa Fe Trail, reports of time anomalies decreased but never fully stopped. Modern drivers on highways that follow the old trail route occasionally report similar experiences. GPS devices malfunction, hours pass without explanation, and travelers arrive at their destinations with no memory of the journey. Whether these are psychological effects of monotonous landscape, magnetic anomalies affecting perception, or something genuinely strange about the area remains unexplained. These are the stories historians don't want to talk about because they complicate the neat, rational narrative of westward expansion. The Old West wasn't just cowboys and outlaws. It was a place where reality seemed thinner, where the impossible happened regularly, and where people encountered things they couldn't explain with science or reason. Here's what you need to understand. These 20 stories aren't campfire tales or drunk ravings. They're documented events with multiple witnesses, newspaper reports, official investigations, and physical evidence that still exists in some cases. But they don't fit the story we tell ourselves about American history. They don't fit the Hollywood version, so they get buried, dismissed, or explained away. The Old West was stranger and darker than any movie ever showed. It was a place where entire towns vanished, where creatures from prehistory might still be alive, where the dead didn't always stay buried, and where reality itself seemed to break down in specific locations. Whether you believe in the supernatural, extraterrestrials, or psychological mass hysteria, you can't deny that something very weird was happening out there. So what's the truth? Maybe we'll never know. Maybe that's the point. The West was a place where anything seemed possible because the rules of civilization hadn't been fully imposed yet. The land was wild, The people were desperate or crazy or both, and the frontier was a place where myths could become real because there was no one around to tell you they couldn't. Drop a comment and tell me which story freaked you out the most. Hit like if you want more buried history that doesn't make sense. Subscribe because next week we're going even deeper into the unexplained. And remember, just because it sounds impossible doesn't mean it didn't happen. The frontier proved that over and over again.